Thanks to POCO for sponsoring this video. This is the F7 Ultra, and it is currently the least expensive way you can get a phone with the Snapdragon 8 Elite chip, with POCO not only giving it a flagship level processor, but also including a couple of features that help it even compete with phones that cost nearly twice as much. Starting off with what they include in the box, where you get this actually nice case for the phone. It's not one of those cheapo ones, and then you get this monster of a power brick that gives you up to 120 watts of fast charging, provided that you use this included 6-amp cable. But taking a look at the phone itself, we got it in this yellow variant. I think they also offer it in black if you're not so adventurous, but this color has started to grow on me, especially with the matte finish it has, along with the matte black metal frame. The buttons all sit on the right side of the phone, the USB-C port and the SIM tray are at the bottom, and while there isn't an IR blaster at the top, turns out the phone actually does have one, it's just hidden in the camera housing. Which, speaking of the camera, you get a 50 megapixel main sensor, there's a 50 megapixel what they call floating telephoto lens, and an upgraded 32 megapixel ultra wide, which is a big step up from the 8 megapixels previously. We'll talk more about the cameras in a bit, but finishing up with the body, the rear glass has this slight curve on it, which I think makes it more comfortable in your palm. The corners are rounded so it doesn't poke into your palm, and then on the front though, the glass sits completely flush with the frame, which combined with the drop resistant shield glass and the phone's IP68 water rating means this thing should be pretty durable. It definitely feels solid in the hand, while also being comfortable, like I said. Like the fingerprint scanner, for example, is in the correct location, with this also being an ultrasonic sensor, meaning it's gonna work more reliably than the optical ones that you typically get at this price point. Now, in terms of the display, it's a 120Hz 1440p panel, so you have plenty of resolution, and POCO claims that it can reach up to 3200 nits of peak brightness, which, is really bright, but only in a super small window. So I think the more important metric, at least to me, is global brightness, where the entire screen is lit up white, where we measured it at 900 nits after 5 minutes, which matches a phone like the iPhone 16 and beats the iPhone 16e, which, hey, not bad for a phone that gives you double the refresh rate. The F7 Ultra also has some pretty decent speakers on it, which is nice to see since this is an area where a lot of times manufacturers cut corners. But these speakers sound pretty good. Just take a listen for yourself. So you definitely don't get as much in the lower frequencies compared to the Galaxy at least, but overall, I think it's really competitive, especially at this price point where it's both loud while still delivering clean and undistorted audio. But the biggest selling point on this phone, obviously, is its price to performance ratio, with it not only featuring that flagship level Snapdragon 8 Elite, but POCO also gave it a whole separate chip called the Vision Boost D7. It's a dual core chip, which is made specifically to enhance the gaming experience. In Antutu, the F7 Ultra scored a whopping 576,000 in CPU, over 1.1 million in GPU, which is surprisingly higher than even the Galaxy S25 Ultra, with it also scoring higher in both memory and in UX. And the good news is this actually translates into real-world performance. We did a mini speed test against the iPhone 16 just to see how it stacks up, where in apps like Word and Excel, they were pretty much matched. I wouldn't expect too much of a difference there. But the 8 Elite has just been crushing it in things like photo and video editing, which helped the F7 Ultra beat the iPhone 16 by a pretty big margin. But where the F7 Ultra's performance surprised me the most was in a 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme benchmark, where I feel like this benchmark does a really good job at pushing phones to their limits, testing not just their peak performance for gaming, but also how they maintain that performance over time. Where while the Galaxy S25 Ultra did slightly better in that first loop, it throttled down from the second loop all the way through the 20th, with the POCO scoring nearly 1,000 points higher by the last loop, with a 72% overall stability compared to the Galaxy's 54%. which, in the context of an extended or a long gaming session, could be the difference between dropping some frames and not. But obviously that's just a benchmark, right? When we played a real game like Genshin Impact at 60 FPS for an hour, both phones did pretty well, as you'd expect from the Snapdragon 8 Elite. But there was one difference that we noticed, which is the POCO ran a little bit cooler after that hour, which probably explains why it outperformed in the benchmarks, since it's most likely avoiding thermal throttling. But I think the bigger difference you'll notice, at least immediately, is when you start tapping into that D7 chip, where not only does it give you the ability to boost frame rates from like 60 FPS in Genshin to 120, but it also enables super resolution, where it'll upscale everything in the game to give you a sharper image. So here in Genshin, with smart frame rate turned on, you can see just how much smoother the POCO looks compared to the Galaxy. Since while the game is running at its native 60, which is the max that you can get on Android, using frame interpolation, the D7 is adding new frames in between those native frames to effectively give you 120. And it's a similar story with super resolution, where the D7 is upscaling things to give you a sharper image with more detail, to the point where honestly, the Galaxy almost looks blurry in comparison. Like, I had to double check to make sure that we had them at the same settings, but they were, and it's just that the upscaling makes everything look like it's at a higher texture level. Now, that's not to say that this stuff is perfect. As with any frame interpolation or upscaling tech, it can sometimes lead to artifacts in games, since technically it's adding details that aren't really there. But you can always turn the feature off if you want, and what's cool is because it's running independently of that Snapdragon chip, you can turn on smart frame rate, super resolution, and even a game HDR mode all at the same time without affecting the main chip's performance. So it's pretty cool, and the only real cost there is to it is slightly more battery usage, which you'd kind of expect. Speaking of battery though, it is excellent on this phone. We did our standard 2-day battery test where the 5300 mAh battery in here was able to outlast both the iPhone 16 and the 16e by over an hour. It wasn't quite able to match the Galaxy though, surprisingly, where it came up 26 minutes short despite having a slightly bigger battery. But nonetheless, when it comes to charging those batteries, it is no contest. With that 120 watt fast charger getting the F7 Ultra up to a whopping 90% in just 30 minutes, compared to the Galaxy's 69% and the iPhone's 55%. Plus, if you want to go wireless, you can still get up to 50 watts of fast charging, although if you go that route, you do have to buy that accessory separately. Alright, moving on to the camera system. I'm actually pretty impressed with what POCO is pulling off at this price point. The main 50 megapixel camera gets you some pretty great looking shots in both daylight and in low light conditions, and in a lot of instances it goes toe to toe with the S25 Ultras. Obviously there is some back and forth between the two. In some situations the POCO had the edge, while in others it was the Galaxy. But overall, this main sensor seems to be pretty solid, and I feel like it's really benefiting from that Snapdragon ISP. The new 32 megapixel ultrawide is definitely a big step up compared to the 8 megapixels from previous generations, so images come out looking sharper with a lot more detail in them. And then the 50 megapixel telephoto, while it gives you a 2x zoom, so it's not going to give you a huge zoom range like the Galaxy's does, 2x is kind of ideal for portrait shots. Plus, it also has a macro mode that lets you get up to 10 centimeters away from a subject to get those really sharp and fine details. That said though, I don't want to give you the impression that this camera system is going to beat the Galaxy across the board, because it's not. Like, for example, the 2x telephoto, while it's good for portraits, you don't get the same zooming capabilities as the Galaxy's 5x camera. And while the new 32 megapixel ultrawide is a big step up in terms of sharpness, for video, for some reason, it's still limited to 1080p instead of 4K. But then again, we are talking about a phone that costs half as much. So, given its price point, I think this camera system is more than holding its own. Now, in terms of software, the phone is running on Android 15 with Xiaomi's HyperOS 2. And as you'd expect from a phone in 2025, it has a ton of AI integrated. Not just the typical stuff though, like erasing things in photos and removing reflections, but also a deep integration with Gemini in POCO's own apps like Notes and Calendar. And overall, I found the UI to be pretty clean. There wasn't any bloatware installed on our unit, and while we don't yet have an official statement from POCO in terms of the update policy, based on their previous generations, it was around 3 years for OS updates and 4 years of security patches, so I would expect something similar with this one. But yeah, that's the POCO F7 Ultra. It's a solid overall phone, and definitely one that I would consider if I was looking for a phone with the absolute lowest price with the Snapdragon 8 Elite chip. It currently MSRPs at $649 US, but there are some early bird discounts that I'll be dropping down below in the description. Anyways, that is it for me in this video. Big thanks to POCO for sponsoring this showcase. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the very next episode.